The clock in the corner of the dim studio ticked toward midnight as Olivia Marsh leaned closer to the microphone, her voice wrapping the silence like velvet. The red on-air light glowed, casting a soft hue on her pale face. Outside, the city was asleep beneath a curtain of rain. Inside, her voice drifted through 1,000 darkened bedrooms, truck stops, and quiet kitchens, carried by radio waves into the ears of those who couldn't close their eyes. Her show, Midnight Secrets, was more than just another late-night true crime program. It was a ritual for insomniacs and wanderers of the night. People said her voice could make even the most horrifying stories sound like lullabies. But tonight something in her tone wavered, as though she were reading her own obituary. "Tonight's story," she began, her voice steady but trembling beneath the surface, "isn't fiction. It's real, and it begins with a man who vanished without a trace." Somewhere, a truck driver turned up the volume. A woman lying alone in bed adjusted her pillow. A student working through the night paused his typing. They listened as Olivia spoke about a man named Daniel Rowe, a small-town history teacher who vanished one rainy Friday 8 years ago. His car had been found abandoned on a dirt road that cut through the woods outside of Harrows Creek, Virginia. The keys were still in the ignition. The driver's door was open. There were no fingerprints, no signs of struggle, just one strange detail. His watch still ticking, lying in the mud beside a single footprint that led nowhere. Olivia described the case with careful precision, her voice rhythmic, each word measured. Daniel Rowe was last seen leaving his classroom around 5:30 p.m., she said, her lips close to the mic. He told a colleague he was heading to meet someone, but he never said who. When police searched his home, they found everything in place. His phone, his wallet, even his packed lunch for the next day. It was as if he had planned to return, but he didn't. The studio was dark except for the faint blue light from the mixing board. Olivia's fingers brushed across the old photograph taped beside her microphone. A smiling young man with messy hair and bright eyes. Daniel. She had kept that picture hidden behind her show notes for years, out of sight from her producers. She told herself it was just a reminder of the story that got away. But deep down it was something else. Guilt, regret, memory. The story had haunted her since college. She had known Daniel Rowe once, long before the world knew his name from newspaper headlines. They'd taken the same journalism class at Ridgefield University. He had been charming, curious, and endlessly stubborn about the truth. "People don't disappear," he used to say. "Someone always makes them disappear." Back then it sounded idealistic. Now those words felt like a warning she had ignored. As she continued narrating, Olivia felt a weight building in her chest. The studio air was thick and heavy. The hum of the old speakers grew louder in her ears, almost like breathing. She pushed through it. "What made Daniel's case strange," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "was that there were no answers. Police followed every lead. They drained the nearby lake. They questioned colleagues, friends, and one former girlfriend." Her lips tightened slightly at that word, girlfriend. But they never found a body. They never found a suspect. And after 8 years, the case was quietly closed. A pause filled the airwaves. Silence always made her audience lean closer. Then softly she said, "But what if I told you that wasn't the whole story?" Her producer glanced up from behind the glass, puzzled. That line wasn't in the script. Olivia ignored him. Something inside her had shifted. Maybe it was the sound of Daniel's name in her mouth after so many years. Maybe it was the ghost of unfinished confessions clawing at her throat. She went on. "There's a detail that never made it to the public reports. Daniel Rowe left behind one letter. It was never released by authorities, but I've seen it." Her producer frowned, mouthing a question through the glass. "Where are you going with this?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled open the drawer beside her and took out an envelope, old, yellowed, sealed with black wax. Her hand trembled. The letter had arrived that very evening, slipped under her studio door without a stamp or return address. She had planned to ignore it, but the curiosity that once drew her to journalism hadn't died. It had only learned to whisper. She opened it now, live on air. Inside was not a letter, but a photograph. Her pulse quickened. It showed a man standing in a dim room, his face half lit by a flickering bulb. Daniel Rowe. The photo looked recent, far too recent. In the background, an old clock read exactly 12 a.m. Scrawled across the bottom in red ink were 5 words. You told his story once. For a long moment she couldn't breathe. The microphone picked up the faint sound of her exhale. Then she turned the photo over. On the back, another line written in the same red ink. Now tell your own. Her throat tightened. She looked toward the glass window separating her from her producer. He was watching her, confused, mouthing again, "What's wrong?" She shook her head. No words came out. The rain outside grew heavier, tapping against the window like fingers. Olivia forced herself to speak, her voice cracking slightly. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "when we chase other people's stories, we forget our own." The listeners thought it was part of her poetic style, a new twist to the usual midnight mystery. But her heart was pounding too loud for her to hear herself clearly. The red studio light flickered, dimmed, and came back on. She looked again at the photograph, her eyes tracing Daniel's face, the familiar half-smile that once made her laugh. It couldn't be real. Daniel was gone. She had convinced herself of that long ago. But what if he wasn't? As she closed the show, her voice softened barely above a whisper. "This is Olivia Marsh, and you've been listening to Midnight Secrets. Remember, every story hides another, waiting for the right hour to speak." She clicked the mic off. The red light went dark. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then, from somewhere behind her, the faintest sound, a clock ticking. She turned sharply, scanning the empty studio. Nothing. Just the hum of machines and the low hiss of static from the monitors. She gathered her notes and the strange photo, tucking them into her bag. Her hands were shaking. As she left the studio and stepped into the hallway, the motion sensor lights flickered on. The long corridor stretched ahead, empty, lined with framed photos of old radio hosts from decades past. She could still hear the faint echo of her last words bouncing off the walls. Every story hides another. By the time she reached her car, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. She sat behind the wheel, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. The photograph lay on the passenger seat beside her, the clock in it frozen at midnight. She remembered something Daniel once said to her on their last night together. The truth has a way of finding its voice, especially at midnight. Her stomach turned. She didn't want to remember what came after that night. The argument, the anger, the threat she made in fear and frustration. The police had asked her about it once, back when Daniel disappeared. She had told them they fought, but she never told them why. She never told anyone what Daniel had discovered, and she had buried it, along with everything else, under years of silence and carefully written scripts. But now it seemed someone wanted her to remember. As the city lights flickered in her windshield and the wipers swiped away the last of the rain, she looked down at the photograph one more time. Daniel's eyes seemed to follow her. Beneath the smudged ink, something else appeared, faint, almost invisible. She tilted the photo under the light, and new words shimmered across it like a whisper from the dark. "I never left." Olivia froze. The ticking sound returned, louder this time, coming from her car radio. She reached for the dial, but before she could turn it off, her own voice came through the speakers, playing on a loop from the earlier broadcast. "Tonight's story isn't fiction. It's real." And as the clock on her dashboard turned to 12 a.m., Olivia finally understood what the message meant. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Olivia barely slept that night. The rain continued until dawn, drumming on the windows of her small apartment, whispering to her in the same voice that had haunted her for 8 years. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel's face from the photo, the faint smirk that once made her trust him, and the clock behind him frozen at midnight. She replayed every word he had ever said to her, especially that final argument before he disappeared. By sunrise, her nerves were raw and she couldn't tell if she had dreamed half of it, or if the letter had really been there. When she finally checked her bag, the photo was still inside. It hadn't been a dream. It was real. The handwriting, the message, the impossible picture, it was all real. By mid-morning, Olivia made a decision. She needed to go to Harrow's Creek, the small town where Daniel had vanished. She hadn't been there since the police had questioned her years ago. She had built her whole life on pretending that place didn't exist anymore. But something about that photograph forced her hand. She canceled her meetings, told her producer she was researching a new story, and hit the road before she could change her mind. The drive took 4 hours through winding roads lined with bare trees and mist. Every mile felt like she was moving backward in time, back into the parts of herself she had worked so hard to erase. When she finally saw the rusted sign that read, "Welcome to Harrow's Creek," her stomach twisted. The town looked even smaller than she remembered. Quiet, almost deserted, like a place trapped between decades. The diner was still there, with the same chipped red booths and faded Coca-Cola sign. The gas station's windows were fogged with dust. And at the end of the main street, past the church and the school, stood the road she'd been dreading. The narrow dirt path that led to Daniel's house. The house itself was barely visible through the trees, half swallowed by vines and shadows. The roof sagged under years of neglect. The windows were broken in places, and the wooden porch creaked as she stepped onto it. For a moment, she hesitated. She knew she shouldn't be there. But curiosity was stronger than fear, and guilt was stronger than both. She turned the doorknob, surprised when it opened with a soft groan. The air inside was cold, heavy with the scent of rot and dust. The wallpaper peeled like old skin, and the silence was so thick that even her breathing sounded wrong. She stepped carefully through the hallway. The living room still had Daniel's bookshelves, though the books were damp and moldy now. Papers were scattered across the floor, pages from lesson plans maybe, or his unfinished research. The sight of them made her chest tighten. She remembered the last time she'd been in this house, when it was still alive. There had been a record playing, something by Miles Davis, and Daniel had been pacing, talking about the university scandal he had uncovered. He'd been excited, reckless, certain he had finally found proof that a group of senior researchers were altering data in a major grant project to secure millions of dollars in fake results. He had begged her to help him go public. She had told him to slow down, to think. She'd even agreed to help him draft the report. But then everything spiraled out of control. Olivia's flashlight beam drifted across the room until it landed on something that didn't belong there. A tape recorder. It sat on the kitchen table, untouched by dust, as if someone had placed it there recently. The little red button was up. The tape inside was labeled 12 a.m. Her hand trembled as she pressed play. For a few seconds, all she heard was static, and then a man's voice came through, soft, whispering, "You shouldn't have told them. Midnight remembers everything." Her heart froze. The voice was low, distorted, but she recognized the rhythm, the way the words lingered. It sounded like Daniel. She pulled the recorder closer to her ear. "You thought you could bury it," the voice continued. "You thought if you turned it into a story, it would fade away. But stories don't die. They wait." She stopped the tape, her pulse racing. How could anyone have known what she said in her private confession? Years ago, when the police had questioned her, she had met one of the detectives off the record. She had told him about the fight with Daniel, how he had accused her of betraying him, how she had destroyed the files he wanted to leak. She told the detective she'd done it to protect them both, but she hadn't told anyone else. Not even her producer, not even her therapist. The only way this recording could exist was if someone had been listening back then, or if Daniel had never really disappeared. Olivia searched the house for anything else that might explain the tape. She found his old notebooks in a drawer, full of scribbled notes and clippings from newspapers about the university funding fraud. One line was underlined twice. "The lies don't stop when the truth dies. They stop when the storyteller does." As she stood there, a cold breeze brushed against her face. One of the windows was cracked open, though she didn't remember opening it. She looked outside, expecting to see the woods empty, but something caught her eye. Fresh footprints in the mud leading away from the house. Her breath hitched. She followed them to the back door, where they disappeared into the trees. The forest beyond looked endless, quiet, suffocating. For a moment she thought about leaving, getting back in her car, driving away, pretending this never happened. But then she saw it. Near the edge of the trees, half buried under fallen leaves, a small silver object glinted in the weak sunlight. She walked toward it, her heart pounding. It was a watch, the same model Daniel used to wear. The glass was cracked, but the second hand was still ticking. She turned it over, and on the back someone had scratched a single word. "Listen." A shiver crawled down her spine. The sound of the ticking filled her ears, rhythmic, relentless. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every branch that creaked, every rustle of leaves felt like footsteps. She clutched the watch tightly and backed away, nearly tripping on the uneven ground. As she stepped back onto the porch, the wind slammed the front door shut behind her. The echo reverberated through the empty woods like a warning. Olivia sat in her car for several minutes before she could bring herself to start the engine. Her reflection in the rearview mirror looked pale, haunted. She tried to convince herself that the tape, the photo, the watch, it all had a logical explanation. Maybe someone was playing a cruel trick. Maybe some obsessive fan of her show had learned about her connection to Daniel and decided to scare her. But no matter how she tried to rationalize it, one truth kept returning. Whoever had left that tape in Daniel's house knew things only he or she could have known. As she drove back toward town, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It read, "Nice work on the broadcast. You made him sound innocent this time." Olivia nearly dropped the phone. She glanced at the rearview mirror, but the road behind her was empty. Another message appeared seconds later. "Go back to where it ended." She knew exactly what that meant. The old lake, the one they had searched after Daniel vanished. The police had found his car nearby, but they never found any sign of him in the water. She hadn't gone there since the day of the search. When she reached the edge of the lake, the sun was dipping behind the trees, staining the surface of the water with gold. The place was silent except for the soft ripples of wind. She stepped out of the car, holding the photograph in one hand and the watch in the other. The air smelled the same, wet earth and pine. It felt frozen in time, untouched by years. She walked to the edge of the water, staring at her reflection. "Daniel," she whispered, "if you're out there, what do you want from me?" Something moved beneath the surface, a ripple, faint but deliberate, spreading outward. She stepped back, her breath catching. The ripples faded, leaving the lake still again. But when she turned to leave, she saw something in the dirt at her feet. A new footprint. A man's footprint larger than hers, pressed deep into the soil. She looked around, her pulse racing. "Who's there?" she called. The woods gave no answer. But the watch in her hand began to tick louder, impossibly loud, until it sounded like a heartbeat. She dropped it and the ticking stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Olivia stood there, trembling, knowing one thing with chilling certainty. Someone wanted her to uncover what she had helped hide. And whatever this was, it wasn't finished. It was only getting started. That night, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that the walls of her apartment were listening. The ticking from Daniel's watch seemed to echo in her head long after she had left it by the door. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside her window, felt like a message she couldn't quite decipher. She made tea just to give her hands something to do, but they wouldn't stop trembling. When the clock on her kitchen wall hit 11:45, she knew she wouldn't sleep. She grabbed her keys, her coat, and the photo of Daniel, then drove to the studio. If she couldn't silence her thoughts, she could at least turn them into something she understood. A story. The building was quiet when she arrived. Only the faint hum of electronics filled the air. She walked down the long corridor, her footsteps echoing off the tile. Every door she passed seemed to hide a secret. When she stepped into her booth, the familiar scent of dust and warm wires hit her. The red recording light waited patiently, a single dot of blood in the darkness. She sat down, turned on the microphone, and began to speak. Not for the audience this time, but for herself. "Tonight," she said softly, "our story takes a darker turn." Her voice trembled at first, but she kept talking. What happens when a story doesn't want to stay buried? When it claws its way back to the surface, dragging you down with it. Her words hung in the still air. Sometimes the truth waits for years, watching you, waiting for midnight. The sound of her own voice calmed her, at least for a moment. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw the light on the phone console blink. Line 3. It shouldn't have been active. No calls were scheduled this late. The phone had been disconnected during her unscripted broadcast to prevent interruptions. She stared at it, waiting for the light to fade, but it didn't. Slowly, she reached over and pressed the button. "Midnight Secrets," she said, her voice steady, though her stomach tightened. "You're on the air." Silence. The kind of silence that makes you doubt your own hearing. Then a breath, soft, deliberate. A man's voice followed, calm and cold. "You left him in the woods, Olivia." Her heart stopped. For a second, she couldn't speak. "Who is this?" she whispered. "You know who I am," the voice said. It was distorted, faintly electronic, like it was coming through an old tape recorder. "You buried the truth, but you can still dig it up. Go back to where it started." Then the line went dead. The studio filled again with the low hum of static. Olivia stared at the phone, her mind spinning. That same message, "Go back to where it started." It was what the text had said earlier. What Daniel's recording had implied. What the watch seemed to whisper every time she picked it up, but none of it made sense. Daniel was gone. He had to be gone. She felt dizzy. Her eyes darted toward the small security camera above the door. The red light was blinking. She realized, with a cold twist in her gut, that the footage was probably recording every second of this. She got up and walked into the control room to check the computer. The feed from the booth flickered on the monitor. But when she rewound it to just a few seconds before the call, she froze. There, on the screen behind her chair, was a faint reflection in the glass. Someone standing in the hallway outside her booth. A tall figure, barely visible, watching through the window. But the hallway was empty when she turned around. The air felt suddenly colder. Her instincts told her to leave, to lock herself in her car and drive away. But the same instinct that had once made her a good journalist told her she couldn't stop now. Something bigger was happening. Someone wanted her to uncover the truth, or maybe someone wanted her destroyed. Either way, she needed to know. She grabbed her coat, the recorder, and her flashlight and drove out of the city once again. The highway was empty, the moon hanging low and pale like a dying bulb in the sky. Her headlights sliced through the fog that clung to the trees along the road. She followed the same route Daniel had taken 8 years ago, the road that led into the woods where his car had been found. Every mile felt heavier. The memories she had buried began to resurface with each passing tree. Daniel's voice shouting at her. The look in his eyes when she told him she couldn't help him anymore. The fear when he said he had proof that would end everything. When she reached the clearing, the forest was wrapped in silence. The outline of the abandoned car, long since towed away, still imprinted itself in her memory. She parked and stepped out, the air damp and cold. The woods were alive with the faint rustle of branches. Her flashlight beam caught something ahead, a glimmer of metal hanging from a low branch. She moved closer and gasped. It was the same clock she had seen in Daniel's photo, the one stuck at 12 Cal. Someone had tied it there with a piece of wire. Beneath it, the ground was disturbed. Fresh dirt. Her knees gave out before she could stop herself. She dropped to the ground, brushing away leaves, then clawed at the soil. Her fingers hit something hard, a metal box, rusted and dented. She dug it out and opened it. Inside were several cassette tapes, each labeled Midnight Secrets. Episode 1, 2, 3. Her breath hitched when she saw the last one. Episode 12, Finale. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Daniel's. Olivia sat back, the world spinning around her. Daniel had recorded something before he disappeared. Had someone found his tapes and used them against her? Or had he left them for her to find? She didn't know. But her instincts told her to listen. She tucked the box under her arm and hurried back to her car. The night seemed to close in as she ran, the trees bending toward her, their branches scraping the air like fingers. She slammed the car door shut and locked it, panting. Her hand shook as she took one of the tapes and slid it into the old cassette player she kept in the glove box. Static filled the car. Then a voice, Daniel's voice. "If you're hearing this, Liv," he said softly, "then I'm gone, and it means they got me." Her throat tightened. She couldn't move. "They won't stop until you tell the truth," Daniel's voice continued. "You think Midnight Secrets is your show? It's not. It's theirs. They used you to broadcast messages, to hide what they were doing." Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, even though he couldn't hear her. "You thought you were telling true crime stories," Daniel went on, his voice trembling. "But every script, every case, every broadcast, they weren't random. Each one was coded. Financial data, encrypted coordinates, confessions disguised as bedtime stories. You were the cover. You were their messenger." The tape clicked off suddenly, leaving only the sound of her own ragged breathing. She couldn't tell if she was shaking from fear or disbelief. The idea was insane, but the evidence, the strange sponsors, the anonymous donations, the restrictions on her topics, it all started to make a terrible kind of sense. Her headlights flickered. Something moved just outside the car, a shadow between the trees. Olivia froze. She leaned forward, squinting through the fogged glass, but couldn't make out the shape. Then came a faint tap on the back window. 1, 2, 3. Slow, deliberate. She turned, but there was nothing there. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, pale and terrified. She started the engine, her heart hammering. As the car roared to life, she threw it into reverse, then stopped. There in the rearview mirror, she saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. Tall, still, watching her. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move as she backed away. She blinked once and it was gone. The drive back to the city was a blur. When she reached the studio parking lot, dawn was already coloring the sky in pale gray. She turned off the engine and sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel. Her mind a storm of fear and disbelief. Daniel's voice still echoed in her ears. "They used you." She looked at the photo again, the one from the envelope. The more she studied it, the more she noticed. Behind Daniel in the shadows, there was something she hadn't seen before. A faint outline of soundproof foam on the walls. A microphone. A booth. The realization hit her so hard she gasped. The photo wasn't taken in some unknown place. It was taken in her studio, the same place she had been sitting hours earlier, telling his story. The same studio where the call had come from. Olivia's hands went cold. Daniel's last words on the tape replayed in her mind, his voice soft and broken. "You thought you were the storyteller, Liv, but you've been part of the story all along." She turned toward the studio building. The red on-air light above her booth was glowing again. She hadn't turned it on, and faintly, through the glass, she heard her own voice playing, an echo of her last broadcast. "Tonight," her voice said, calm and haunting, "our story takes a darker turn." Olivia sat frozen in her car, staring through the windshield at the glowing red light inside her studio. The air felt too still, too thick, as if the world had stopped breathing. She had just spent hours driving through darkness, terrified. her mind full of Daniel's voice and the impossible photograph that placed him inside her booth. And now that same booth was lit again, as if waiting for her. The building was empty. No one should have been there. She turned off the engine but didn't move. Her pulse beat heavy in her ears. Her hands gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles ached. Then slowly, as if pulled by something unseen, she opened the car door. The wind carried a faint hum, a familiar sound, low and rhythmic. The sound of her own voice coming through the speakers inside the studio. She crossed the parking lot, her footsteps echoing against the pavement. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to run, to pretend none of this was real. But she couldn't. She had spent her life chasing stories, digging into the shadows of other people's lives, believing she was immune to fear. Now the story had turned on her, and she had no choice but to see where it ended. When she reached the front door, she found it unlocked. Someone had been here. Someone still might be. The hallway was pitch black except for the thin red glow spilling from under the studio door. She could hear the faint crackle of audio equipment and her own voice from an earlier recording. It repeated the same line over and over. Tonight, our story takes a darker turn. Over and over, the same sentence warped and slowed until it barely sounded human. She stepped closer, heart pounding, and turned the doorknob. The hinges creaked softly. Inside, the studio looked exactly as she had left it, except for one thing. On the table where her notes usually sat, there was a small cassette tape unmarked, waiting. The recorder beside it was already on, the reels spinning slowly, though no sound came out. She stared at it for a long time before pressing stop. The silence that followed was worse than the recording. The air felt electric, charged with something she couldn't name. Olivia took a shaky breath and reached for the tape. Her fingers brushed against it, and then the lights flickered. The speakers crackled, and then a voice filled the room. Daniel's voice. "You shouldn't have come back, Liv," it said softly. Her hand dropped. She spun around, expecting to see someone behind her, but the booth was empty. The reflection in the soundproof glass showed only herself, pale and trembling. "Daniel?" she whispered. "Where are you?" "I told you they'd come for you," the voice said. It wasn't coming from the recorder anymore. It was everywhere. Through the speakers, the intercom, even her headphones hanging on the mic stand. You thought you could keep running the show, telling their stories. But they've always been yours. Her breathing quickened. "Who are they?" No answer. Just static, then faint laughter. It didn't sound like Daniel anymore. It was deeper, distorted, overlapping, like several voices speaking at once. "You made it easy, Olivia. Your show gave us the audience we needed. The truth travels best in whispers." She backed toward the door. "I don't understand. I didn't do anything." "Oh, but you did," the voice interrupted. "You told every lie we needed told. You built a world of truth that no one questioned, and we hid inside it. You helped us cover everything. The disappearances, the money, the experiments, the bodies. You were our voice." The blood drained from her face. "No," she said, shaking her head. "That's not true. I didn't know. I thought I was helping people. I thought I was telling real stories." "You were," the voice said. "You just never asked whose." The lights flickered again, then went out completely. For a moment there was only darkness and the soft tick of the studio clock at 12:09 a.m. When the lights returned, she saw something new. The photographs pinned to the wall past guests' old crime scenes were different. Every photo had been replaced with her own face, captured at different times in different expressions. Her laughing at a Christmas party, her crying during a late broadcast, her asleep in her car. Someone had been watching her for years. Her throat tightened. She turned to run, but the door wouldn't open. The handle wouldn't move. Panic surged through her chest. She pounded on the door, shouting for help, but her voice was swallowed by static. Then she noticed something strange. The red on-air light was still glowing. The broadcast hadn't stopped. Her mic was live. Everything she said was being transmitted. She stepped back to the microphone, trembling. If anyone can hear me, she said, her voice breaking, this isn't a story. This is real. Something is happening here. They've been using me, using this show. Please, someone. The speakers shrieked with feedback, cutting her off. Her own voice came back through them, repeating her words in perfect mimicry but twisted. Each sentence rearranged, reshaped into something else. This is Olivia Marsh, her recorded voice said, calm and eerie. And you're listening to Midnight Secrets. Tonight we tell Olivia's story. Her blood ran cold. Stop it, she whispered. Turn it off. But the recording continued, her own voice narrating as if reading a script written for her. It began with a letter, a photograph, a voice from the past. She thought she could escape it, but the truth always comes home. Olivia stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the desk. The lights dimmed again, and a shadow moved in the corner of the room. She turned slowly. A man stood there, half hidden in the darkness. Tall, still, face obscured. "Daniel?" she breathed. The figure didn't answer. It stepped closer, the light revealing just enough to see the outline of his face. Familiar, impossibly familiar. It was Daniel, but not the way she remembered him. His skin was pale, his eyes hollow, his expression calm, almost peaceful. "You finally told the right story," he said softly, his voice no longer distorted. "Now it's time to sleep." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" "Daniel, what's happening?" He moved closer until he was only a few feet away. "They needed a final confession," he said. "An ending. Every story needs one. You built it for them. You kept their secrets, buried them in words, dressed them in truth. You did your job." Tears filled her eyes. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." "I know," Daniel said. "But it doesn't matter anymore. The story's already written." He reached out his hand. For a second, she thought about taking it. But then the studio door burst open. The light outside flooded in, and the figure vanished, leaving only the empty room, the flickering red light, and the sound of the tape recorder starting again. The last thing Olivia remembered was the hum of the machines fading into silence. The next morning, the Midnight Secrets building was empty. The janitor found the studio door ajar, the microphone still on, broadcasting dead air. On the desk lay the photograph of Daniel. The edges burned black, and beside it Olivia's necklace tangled around the cassette labeled Finale. No one ever found her. The only clue was the final broadcast, an hour of faint whispers and static that, when played backward, sounded like breathing. Weeks later, the show returned to the air. Same time, same station. A new voice introduced it. A calm, deep male voice that listeners swore they recognized but couldn't place. "Good evening," it said. "Welcome back to Midnight Secrets. Tonight we tell the story of Olivia Marsh, the woman who vanished on air. Sometimes the storyteller becomes the story, and sometimes the story never ends." Listeners across the country heard a faint sound at the end of that episode. A woman's voice, barely a whisper. "Good night, Daniel," it said. Then the line went silent and the red light faded as the clock struck midnight once more.